It's good to be with all of you this morning, and thank you for joining us. I'm really glad that you are here to meet Gayla Tillman, who is an organizer with Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Gayla was born here in Atlanta, born and raised. They have a degree in Africana Studies from Georgia State, have designed various trainings and hosted events centering on an array of social justice issues. Formerly, they worked with Georgia conservation voters and were the civic engagement organizer. They work at the intersection of environmental justice and civic engagement to work towards energy equity and justice, clean water, and accessible climate solutions. All the things we have been talking about in the last couple of weeks. Please join me in welcoming Gayla. I'll say just a couple more things and then hand it over to you. So as you know, this is the third, I'm gonna drop my mask here. This is the third offering of the series that we've been doing called Listening to the Voice of Creation. And a part of that is also our River Day cleanup this afternoon, which I hope to see you all at soon. And we've been talking throughout the series about the twin tasks of ecological contemplation, how spending time in incubation and in silence and in awe and wonderment about the world outside brings us to a place of responsibility and action. And today we're going to be focusing a little bit on that second part. Again, once Gayla presents for us and asks questions, if you'd like to talk, I would love to give you this mic to use. So do just raise your hand for the people who are joining us online so that they know who's speaking, because sometimes the owl lags behind. I just want to ask you to say your name first and then go ahead and make your comment or ask your question. Any questions before we get started officially with Gayla? That is. No. All right, well, let us pray. The Lord be with you. God, we give you thanks for another beautiful fall day. Give you thanks for this opportunity to learn and grow together. Bless our conversation and continue to lead us by your Spirit into effective action on behalf of your world. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much for that introduction. Also, should I be using that?
I think this one on.
It's on. Okay.
Yeah. So
Okay.
last like
Yeah, absolutely. So I hope everyone can do just fine. Good morning / early afternoon. It's great to see you all. Thank you all for having me. As stated, my name is Gayla Tillman. I'm a policy associate at Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. And today we're going to be talking about taking action locally to lower the community in the climate justice movement. And so this is just like a brief agenda of like what we'll be talking about. We're going to be talking about like a couple of like buzz terms that you have likely heard, but like I'll dive deeper into. Why is we people of faith should be hearing about this issue? A little bit of history of the environmental justice movement. What are some of the environmental justice priorities that we've seen come up in the past years? An example of like locally what's happening in Atlanta. And then of course, priorities for Georgia, and then how you can take action. So you guys may have heard this word called environmental justice, and I want to kind of like go over like what okay. Environmental justice is a term you've likely heard, and I want to make sure that like there's a kind of like understanding of like how I understand it as we go through this presentation. So environmental justice is the idea that all people and communities, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, have the right to equal environmental protection under law and the right to live, work, and play in communities that are safe, healthy, and free of life-threatening conditions. So later in the presentation, I'm going to give examples of how, all communities don't have those like basic things. And then environmental racism any policy, practice, or directive that affects or disadvantages, where intended or unintended, individuals, groups, or communities based on race. And then last but not least is greenwashing. The process of a major corporation or organization utilizing nature or green-related messaging and principles as a deflection from accountability or cover from other harmful practices. So, for example, like a major gas utility that's being held accountable for the amount of pollution, like if they come out with a campaign, it's like, hey, also we plant trees, like that is a form of greenwashing, in which it's let's deflect or not take accountability for the harms that we're committing in the community. So why should we as people of faith care? Like why is this, something that we should prioritize? And it's because justice for creation cannot be achieved without fully addressing environmental injustices impacting our neighbors and communities. So we can't witness these horrible floods, people getting, displaced from their houses and things like that, death tolls, land loss and things like that, without engaging morally what that says about the society that we live in. As people of faith, we are called to do this work of justice. We must begin to dismantle the systems which perpetuate environmental injustice, environmental degradation, and climate change. Although there's a lot that we can do as individuals, there are systemic issues that can't be solved outside of local, state, and federal policy work. And I'm going to give like some specific examples because it's one thing to say like me as Gayla, I volunteer at this organization or something like that, versus hey, me and my congregation are going to do this specific action, just like what we're going to see later today with World War. And so just a little bit of history of like environmental justice, where did it come from? Why are we bringing this up? And like, kind of like, what is the timeline of evolution? And so back in the 1980s in North Carolina, there was a lot of problems with hazardous waste. A group of African Americans gathered together and basically demanded that this was unsafe for the community. And thus that gave birth to kind of like this national attention on having not only hazardous waste, but also about like environmental racism, because they knew they were in proximity to that hazardous waste because of their race, because they were in a predominantly Black neighborhood. And so over time, reports come out about specifically naming how Black and brown people are in higher proximity to landfills, to hazardous waste, thus giving birth to the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, where there's like an official, like, I should have pulled up like the full like tenets of environmental justice, but there are like an actual like platform of what it means to abide by environmental justice. And then that gave birth to the Office of Environmental Equity, and then also executive order to make environmental justice part of the federal decision-making process. The one thing that I will add that happened recently is I believe the EPA has developed another office within the EPA that I believe is the Office of Civil Rights. So even more, as we continue to progress through the years, it's really significant for us to acknowledge how it's one thing to say, oh, we fight for climate justice, and another thing to actually critically engage with who are we prioritizing, who is most harmed in the community, and how are we prioritizing those people. So once again, this is a little bit of history. So back in, of course, 1950s and 1960s are most notable for the Civil Rights Movement. So in 1968, there was a Memphis sanitation workers strike that Dr. King went down to Memphis to be on the front line with those workers in solidarity with them. And so this gave birth to this conversation about what does it mean for people across different issue areas? Because of course, we know Dr. King as the most notable voting rights advocate in American history. So what does it mean for people across different issue areas to come together and say, this is wrong, like regardless of what issue area you're in, this is wrong. And so 1950s and 60s, like really kind of like built the momentum. And then as we progress to the 80s and 90s, is where we see like official establishment of offices and things like that. And as we see today, most recently, we've been able to pass the Inflation Reduction Act because this kind of like incremental increase in care about our planet. And so what is an actual priority? Like, what is something people are actually fighting for? So you guys are more than likely familiar with the Flint water crisis, in which people in the Flint, Michigan community were drinking extremely dangerous, contaminated water because of a plethora of things. One of the major things being their water does not abide by EPA guidelines of what is the safe amount of lead in your water. And so that's one of the priorities, is that like, when we say clean drinking water, it's not like some, number that we make up. It's not, something that we just say. It's a very specific goal that we are trying to achieve. And so that is one of the examples of like, what is an environmental justice priority, and specifically making sure that Black and brown communities have the same requirements that are met across the nation. So for example, if there should be no lead in water, that should be a rule across the board, not no lead in some white communities and then some lead in Black and brown communities. So that's what we mean by like environmental justice priorities. And then of course with air quality, it's very similar. Black and brown folks have a higher likelihood of asthma and other respiratory diseases because of our proximity to air pollution and bad air quality. And so typically people think about asthma, but it's also really significant to think about like throughout this pandemic. And so throughout the pandemic with COVID, it started off kind of like as a respiratory disease that's since evolved, but it's really significant to think about that because Black and brown children were more likely to get COVID because of the bad air quality, because you are not in a school that has better air filtration. And so that's what it means. That's what I mean when I say it's really significant for us to think about these other issue areas and really connect them. Because educators are like, oh, I want better air quality because, I want to make sure my kids are safe, but also us as environmental advocates, we care about air quality because they may be in proximity to, a hazardous waste site or something like that and not have it. Which goes into this next part about hazardous waste sites. They are also called Superfund sites, that's what the EPA calls them. I did not memorize the exact metric the EPA uses to establish the Superfund site, but they are called Superfund sites. There is a map of them all over that shows where they are all over the state. There's a significant amount of them in Georgia, and there's an entire process dedicated to how you engage the community about if they're near hazardous waste sites. However, the EPA may not always, do their due diligence of making sure that the community is included in that process, which once again, that's where the harm comes in. Because if people in that community are not included in, not a part of the very beginning of like, hey, here's this hazardous waste problem, here's what you do about it. Like if you're not included in that from the beginning, that leads to a ripple effect of you being left out of the conversation. Thus, you have things like the Flint water crisis. And then once again, global warming, the warming of the planet. And so what we recently saw with Texas is very similar to Georgia, overwhelmingly hot state that I won't say randomly, but got a unnatural ice storm that left thousands, if not millions of Texans vulnerable to our natural disasters. And so this is what we mean when we say environmental justice has specific things that we can ask for so that all of us are living on a just and fair planet. So what does this mean for Georgia? Has he been involved? What are some campaigns that are recently going on? And so I wanted to play this video. I just want to preface this and say that this video is about housing. It's about a housing problem that was happening in the Peopletown area, and still, I believe still to this day, there are still a lot of legal implications to it. But I wanted to bring this up because as environmental advocates, typically we think about oh, what's going on with water issues, and specifically, air quality and things like that. So I also want to pay attention to how this intersects with other social issues.
Atlanta is known as the Black Mecca, but much of its growth has been at the expense of its Black residents, like the families in Peoplestown who can.
Same fine. Oh, it's not out of sync for y'all?
It's a little.
Is it out of sync? Okay. Well, I just didn't want that to be bothersome and then y'all. Okay.
Continue to be displaced by highways, stadiums, parking lots, and expensive vanity infrastructure projects. Working class Black folks are not only unable to afford to live in Atlanta, they are no longer welcome here.
This block consists of 29 homes. The city has acquired most of them so that they can continue to demolish them like this, but there are still 4 homeowners who are holding out.
Over the last 9 years, the city's design for its gentrification park have changed. What has not changed is the fact that the city's own engineer testified in court that the taking of 27 homes on the block was never necessary.
We did not have sufficient engineering data to go from 3 to 4 homes where you had the severe flooding to displacing an entire block.
This miscarriage of justice was initiated by former Mayor Kasim Reed, who is currently seeking re-election. In 2015, he allowed Miss Maddie Jackson to stay in her home, but that was after the threat of her displacement had exacted a crushing toll on her 94-year-old body and her mental health. Since Miss Maddie's death 1 year ago, the city has resumed its efforts to take her family home, where she lived for 60 years and in which she raised 6 generations. On the other end of the block are Robert and Bertha Darden, who have lived, raised their children, and worshiped in Peoplestown for more than 30 years.
My husband and I, we both are retired. But the problem, when we realized that the city was going to sue us and the type of lawyers we needed and engineer, it was going to cost a lot of money. And I'm not talking about 1,000. I'm talking about thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars of legal fees, engineering fees that we have been indebted to because we didn't want to sell our home. We didn't want to give our home up. So we fought to stay in our home.
This 9-year fight, 5 of which have been in court, has cost the Dardens hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they both had to come out of retirement to pay their engineering experts and lawyers. As it did with Miss Maddie, the struggle to stay in their homes is taking a toll on their health. We are asking you to help us help these legacy residents pay their mounting legal fees when they should be spending time with their families, not fighting the city of Atlanta to stay in their homes. These are the kinds of legacy residents the city of Atlanta should be fighting to protect, and Peoplestown is the kind of community the city should be fighting to preserve.
Oops. So I just really wanted to show that video because it's really significant for us to understand that in order for us to participate locally, we have to tap in with what's happening to our neighborhood. And so, for example, the reason why the Darden and Miss Maddie Jackson, why she was experiencing this and why they're experiencing this is because they want to put in a stadium, or because they want to put in, you know, a highway, or they want to put in something that isn't necessarily related to what is exactly needed. Someone literally from the city of Atlanta testified that it wasn't necessary, that they didn't provide the data that it was necessary. And so I just really wanted to highlight this because A, it's very special to me in my heart. I don't know if you guys noticed, but I am in fact in this video. Introduction to be more climate involved, because it's one thing for me to say, oh, I care about justice and equity, and another thing to say, what is happening to the natural environment that we are actually doing these things in. And so that's just another example of how these different issue areas in this medical climate. And so I wanted to talk, because last week I believe y'all were with my wonderful colleague Hannah, who talked about Drawdown, Georgia. And I wanted to briefly talk about their emissions tracker. So of course, right in the center, you see Atlanta with like pretty solid yellow, which is not great. And then you've got little pockets of red that are in like rural parts of the state. And so it's really significant that people understand that when we're talking about emissions, these different plants and, plants, whether mining or otherwise, is not necessarily a thing specific to a specific region. Like, it's not like, oh, it's Atlanta because that's where all the people are, and this, that, and the third. There are also pockets of rural Georgia that are suffering because you've got rural communities who aren't being listened to. You've got rural communities who, may rely on those jobs, but may not know the environmental impacts of what it means to have them in their communities. And so this is something I can provide, a link to this to whoever would like it. But essentially, I just really wanted to really show this so that way people can understand regionally what are we looking at in terms of like emissions and, the role people are having, the climate crisis. Just because all of this yellow right here, not only does the city of Atlanta, but also several cities surrounding the city of Atlanta have a clean energy ordinance. So what does it mean? Like, what progress are we making on these clean energy ordinances if we're still seeing these high emissions? And so one of the solutions that people will try to present is biomass. I'll say like, oh, biomass is great, it's wonderful, it's perfect. And so you think about things like deforestation, and basically how they even get that biomass and how problematic it is, how it's not carbon neutral, how the fact that even still burning biomass is still very much so contributing to pollution. And then of course those biomass plants that are producing that pollution are in Black and brown communities. And so what exactly does it mean for it to be, an environmental justice or climate justice solution if it's not actually benefiting the people it's supposed to benefit? Like if it's not actually serving the purpose of providing harm-free.
Could you just define biomass again with that?
Oh, apologies. Biomass is essentially what some may call like an energy source in which you burn like either like wood pellets or some form of like natural component just to produce energy. So similar to coal, except for instead of the coal, like it's like trees, like debris, stuff like that.
And a lot of it shipped to Europe.
Sorry, what did you say?
A lot of pellets are shipped to Europe.
Oh.
Policy that required that they use a certain amount of biomass, so we're actually cutting out our forests, make pellets to ship them to Europe.
Another reason that it's just problematic. So I wanted to present this because I really wanted to lay out what are some of the environmental justice priorities, what's an example, and kind of like what are some of the solutions that don't revolve around, being harmful to our. Another issue that's here in Georgia is this thing called energy burden. Energy burden is essentially if your your energy bill is higher than how much you make, then you are considered energy burden. And that specific metric is above 6%. So if you're above 6%, then you are considered an energy burden household. Just like for me, I live in the energy burden zip code, meaning that a significant portion of my income goes to my energy bill. And so it's really significant for us to think about this because I think the highest energy bill that I've heard in the state of Georgia, I think was $1,200. $1,200 for 1 month of energy. And so it's really important to think about our numbers because A, it's astronomical, but also the people who have those really high energy bills are government dependent or do not have housing. So that's another issue that's here in the state of Georgia. And then we are the fourth most energy expensive state. So we're not doing too hot in terms of making progress on energy efficiency. So that way people don't have these high energy bills. And so one thing I do want to mention is that the thing that we can do, this goes back to what I was saying about collective action, is us as individuals, yes, it does bother us that we have high energy bills. However, we can gather together and let the Public Service Commission, which I'll bring up briefly in the next slide, we can gather together and let the Public Service Commission know, hey, we care that there are high bills in the state of Georgia, and this is the type of advocacy we want to do to make sure Georgians aren't having these extremely high bills.
And that just goes back to intersecting with the housing stuff that you're saying, because obviously if folks are having high energy bills, then either there's issues with insulation or even the systems that are brought into various spaces and whatnot.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm so glad that you brought that up, because here in the state of Georgia, there's a piece of legislation that's called the Territorial Act, basically meaning that you don't really compete for utilities where you live. So for example, right now, I have a Verizon Wireless, where several of you in this room, like we have a different internet, cell phone provider. Whereas with utilities, that's not necessarily the case. So where I live, I can't just decide not to be a Georgia Power customer and maybe, shop for an EMC or the city's utility. Like, I have to be a Georgia Power customer. And that's throughout the entire state of Georgia. So where you live dictates where your energy comes from and who provides it to you. And so that's why it's really important for us to understand these different intersections, so that way we know when we gather together, we're fighting for better communities at large. So these are the public service commissioners. I want to show their faces because people don't often know who these people are. So we have Chairwoman Trisha Pardmore, Vice Chair Tim Ethel, Commissioner Fitz Johnson, Commissioner Lauren Bubba McDonald, and Commissioner Jason Shaw. These people are statewide positions. There were supposed to be 2 people on the ballot this coming election. However, that is not happening at this current moment, because this election was found to be in violation of the Voting Rights Act. Because people of color, once again, goes back to what I was saying earlier, a group of people of color sued the Secretary of State, basically under the basis that people of color cannot elect a candidate of choice to the Public Service Commission race, because the voting power is diluted, because they are statewide races. So a judge basically said, you're right. And so because these elections were found in violation of the Voting Rights Act, I'm actually not for certain how they're going to go about in the next couple of years. I just know that these are people all of us should know, because of regardless of what happens. If you flip a switch in the state of Georgia, you should know who these people are and
So let me ask, at this point, who would you say are environmentally friendly commissioners?
and I have to say this, but as nonpartisanly as possible. I would say, in terms of, I'll name commissioners that have made environmental steps. I'll name that. So Commissioner Tim Ethel, net metering is a policy that is what makes solar affordable for businesses and things like that. Commissioner Tim Ethel, the current cap on net metering, who can participate in that program right now is 5,000. And Commissioner Tim Ethel raised a motion this past IRP to increase it. I can't remember the exact number. I just know that he made a motion to increase it. Bubba McDonald supported it. Unfortunately, it did not carry across the entire commission. So I did want to raise that Tim Ethel is a supporter of not only electric vehicles, but also of solar. And very similarly for Bubba McDonald, transparently, Fitz Johnson is a relatively new commissioner. So I think he may still be trying to figure out what even his positions are on things. But I would say in terms of commissioners that make that have put forth, motions or steps to make sure that we can either increase solar accessibility or some form of electric vehicle. I would say Tim Ethel and Bubba, but also would say that Jason Shaw has also shown interest in solar. Which is not to say that the other commissioners are like anti-solar. I would just say that those are the ones that are putting forth motion.
So there is no requirement that they be geographically diverse among these commissioners?
I mean, if anything, the major requirement is that they live in their district, which those districts have recently, that 2 districts have recently changed. But the main requirement is that they live in their district. There isn't a requirement in terms of being because the districts are pretty big. Just like I was saying, just before, I think it was almost the entirety of South Georgia. So I think that's a wonderful question that we're not. I haven't seen what the Public Service Commission races look like, but I would love if they could look more like that. If it was like, oh, you have to live in this part of the, state, but also you have to consult or have town halls with everyone in that geographic region. Because there are some folks in South Georgia, like Albany, who said they've never even met or seen their public service commissioner before. So I think that raises a great question about like, what does it mean for you to be in tune? But to my knowledge, no, there's no geographic. And so a little bit later, I'm going to be talking about voting. And so this is why I think it's really significant for us to be thinking about climate and voting. Because we are not too far out from November 8th, but also because these are not elected officials. So we may see the districts and things like that change, but they are still elected officials that impact our energy production and consumption in the state of Georgia. So if you care about less gas, if you care about harm-free energy, these are a group of 5 people that are going to significantly have an impact, not only with Georgia Power, our largest utility, but also with the Georgia legislator, because the public service commissioners, they're subject matter experts on these things. So whenever there's something that's going on with our grid or something like that, and the legislators, they want to make legislation around it, they'll call in the public service commissioners and say like, well, what do you all think? So that's why it's really significant for us to know who they are, and vote with, all of these things in mind. And so, like I just said, they have to balance, giving us reasonable rates with the wants and desires of Georgia Power. And so that's why it's really significant that they hear from us, because if they overwhelmingly hear from Georgia Power, that's going to inform their decision. And then I just wanted to show this kind of like, I hope y'all can see that okay. Maybe I wish I could blow it up a little bit more. But this is a sample Georgia Power bill. Even if you're not a Georgia Power customer, like it looks a little bit similar. And that like the main things I want to raise to you is the environmental compliance costs and the nuclear construction cost recovery, because those are 2 line items that the Public Service Commission approved for Georgia Power to pass on to us. So the environmental compliance cost is Georgia Power was mandated to clean up their coal ash. And so cleaning that up is something they want us as customers to help pay for. And then nuclear compliance, right? And then nuclear compliance cost is they are building a new nuclear plant. And so once again, it's something that they want us help pay for. And so that's why it's really significant for all of us to be in this together. Because it's one thing for one of us to know and be upset about it. It's another thing for us as groups of people. And so I would love it if everyone in this room could take 2 minutes with me to take an action. So if you text Faith Voter 72572, you pledge to be a faith climate justice voter. That means that this coming election or in the incoming election, you are going to be mindful of the fact that our vote matters. As people of faith that care about the climate, we are people that are going to go to the ballot box to protect our common home. And then this QR code right here is going to send you to a petition to tell the Biden administration that we care about making way on his promise to cut emissions. So earlier, I talked about the Inflation Reduction Act. That is the largest climate investment in American history. So if you did any advocacy on getting that passed, I want you to give yourself a pat on the back. And so basically what that means is the Biden administration and the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, are going to be releasing rules talking about how they're going to cut emissions and make sure that we actually have healthy communities that censor children and people who are vulnerable to respiratory diseases. And so when you sign this petition, you tell the Biden administration we want them to do the right thing. So if you've already signed it, you can go and send it to someone else, maybe with a child or someone with who's immunocompromised. This is really significant for us to join together in our community to make sure that it's one thing to say, oh, I care about environmental justice, or I care that people have clean air, and it's another thing to make sure that we are taking action to let our decision makers know that these are our priorities. This is where we want to be. This is what we want to see in our
you can actually scan that from your seat.
Yeah, go read. I shall pause. So yes, top is the voter pledge, because like I said, public service commissioner will also which is legislative, the attorney general are several elected officials that impact our company, that impact everything from the water region, where our energy comes from, the air we breathe, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's really significant that we know, but also our community gather together for these multiple. And then, of course, sending a letter. Because the Clean Power Plan is something birthed out of the Obama administration that's been carried over to the Biden administration. Though, you know, Biden has made his promises, and it's up to us to show that, like, we care that we actually follow through. Okay. I believe, like, and so these are some of like questions that I leave you guys with. Of course, you guys are more than welcome to ask me questions, but these are questions that I leave you with. What is one thing you will tell others about why this work matters as part of the social and environmental justice movement? What are examples of environmental justice issues you know about that we're not discussing in the presentation? What is one way you want to get involved, either as an individual or congregation, in addressing environmental injustice? How does your faith motivate you to address these environmental injustices? And what gives you hope in doing this work, advancing justice for all? And so, of course, these are questions I leave y'all with, but also this is a time where I open the floor to y'all, because I just said a bunch of words. And I love it. And once again, to the full point, that if you do ask a question, please say your name. So that way, let's see.
Could you put the QR code up again?
Oh, yes, for sure. Thank you.
So I'm Mary Curry, and I thought I heard on NPR this week that Georgia Power is asking for a rate increase that's a much larger chunk in the next year. I think they were saying like $14 a month or something. And then it would go down to $1 something the following year. Can you talk about that and what the advocacy around opposing that kind of rate increase or questioning it in some way is? And I have another question. So we'll vote out. The second one was, I think I'm right about this, that the Supreme Court held that the EPA couldn't enforce policies. And so I find that terribly confusing because I thought it was a policy making body, but whatever.
Right.
So could you speak to both those things?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second one because the first one is a longer answer. So to what you just brought up in terms of the Supreme Court a couple months ago ruled on West Virginia, the EPA. That is the decision in which the EPA in which the Supreme Court took away some of the ruling doctrine of EPA, saying that like, hey, it's not really your jurisdiction to make these rules because they are of, political and economic significance, which is a fancy way of saying like, hey, like stay over there, don't do too much because essentially the EPA wants to release rules that says like, hey, businesses need to do X, Y, and Z to decrease emissions. Cities need to do X, Y, and Z to decrease emissions, and those things cost money. And so that was kind of like SCOTUS's way of saying like, hey, EPA, you're doing a lot. If you could just, stay over there a little bit, that'd be great. And so that's essentially what was ruled. Of course, that's not verbatim what was ruled, but it's kind of like the gist of what West Virginia the EPA was. Thankfully, the EPA wasn't completely, stripped of its power of just determining rules, which that's why this link is so significant. But it's confusing because it is essentially a judicial body saying like, hey, you can't regulate this, which is strange, absolutely. And thankfully, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, that actually reinstated some of that power that the EPA had to put those regulations and those guardrails around pollution. And that's why this petition is significant, because right now they need to hear from the American public that we care about those rules, that like that power that they got reinstated, we care that they use it. And so that's to your second question, and then to what you were saying about the rate increases, we work with a multitude of other environmental justice organizations that want to make sure that people are having their voices heard to the Public Service Commission. There's actually a visual, I need to learn the details of it. There's actually gonna be a candlelight visual, basically talking about specifically what I just named, and basically advocating for lower bills. And so what that means is, and it's gonna be at 244 Washington Street. I don't know if y'all have been to the Public Service Commission building, but it's literally right next to the Capitol. And so I can share more information about that. I'll be transparent. Gipple isn't leading on that event, though I totally agree with you about, like, making sure that there's a group of people caring about, making sure people don't have high bills. So those are one of the actions, but there's also going to be an action we're going to share in terms of, during the IRP, we were advocating for a group of congregations wrote letters to public service commissioners in advocacy for net metering and energy efficiency. And more than likely, that will happen again during the rate case, whether that be about net metering or just having lower bills. Like, we're going to really lean into y'all for making sure that, like, people, the commissioners hear from the faith community that we care about this environmental justice part of it. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Thank you.
So that Georgia Power is gonna pay.
Hang on, just.
Okay. So I mean, the raising, John, raising the rates, I assume because of paying for the nuclear plant. It's a lot of it, what I've understood.
Well, that's part of it. So we're paying for the plant, but also paying up coal ash, but also other projects they may be working on. So for example, the commissioners recently voted for them to increase energy efficiency capacity in the state. So honestly, those are two examples that have happened in the past. However, it is right now Georgia Power's decision on what actually they would like to pass on to us. And so that's why we do so much of this Public Service Commission advocacy, because if they don't hear from us, they're going to hear a lot from Georgia Power. And that is Georgia Power's decision to say, like, in the past, we asked for, environmental compliance costs and, the cost for building Plant Vogel. But I mean, could we also include, the cost for, battery storage or something like that? That's a hypothetical, but could happen. So I think it's really significant for us to, keep our eyes peeled for what may be in this. We'll be, a part of the rate case and what's happening. So if anyone has questions or anything like that, feel free to take my contact, or I can share my contact. I thought I had my contact list, but it's not in here. So apologies about that. But if you guys have like questions or anything like that, feel free to reach out to us, because we're going to be very in tune with what's happening. I believe actually either the first hearing for it is either this week or next week. So we're going to be trying to keep you updated on like what's happening and what's happening in the hearing and things like that. So yeah.
When is the vote?
When is the vote for what?
I thought the commissioners were.
So the question is, when is the vote? And I believe your question is around like, when is the vote on like what they want to pass on to our bill? Correct. So over the next couple of months, they're going to be hearing both the people who intervene and Georgia Power, their lawyers, and what have you, things like that. It's going to take a couple of months. And I believe more so into the winter is when we're I don't know the exact date for final decision, because sometimes it moves. But in the winter is when we'll see a final decision on how much we'll be paying.
Jeanette, is there any relationship between what Georgia Power can ask us to pay and what their profits are?
It's a wondrous question. I mean, I imagine, I don't know how to answer that like accurately, like, just because I imagine we help their profits, just because like not only are we paying for our lifetime, but we're also paying these additional things. Because when we pay these things, I don't believe that it's something they're a public owned, they're a public, they're an investor owned utility. So they also have like investors and things like that. So I can't answer honestly just because I don't know, the relationship between.
But there should be some.
Right. So I'm sure there's more than likely some connection. I'm not certain what that number is and just don't want to mislead you. But yeah, so I imagine there is likely an increase in profit, which is great that you bring that up because this past legislative session, one of our partners, Georgia Conservation Voters, was working on a bill called Georgia's First Fund. That is a fund that essentially wanted to use some of those profits to help energy burden, low income families pay for their energy bills. And so, once again, always talking about, but there's really significant outcomes here from us, because those type of policies are really significant. Because those profits, we, may not be able to see exactly what they are, but we know they're there. And so.
So this is confession. Or my IRA has a significant amount of Southern Company stock. And I can tell you since 2010, it's tripled in value, which is lovely for my IRA. But I think it's evidence that the company is doing quite well.
Right.
And it's considered a very conservative investment. So I don't know that that's data, but it certainly is my experience.
Other questions? Yeah, I have a question. And this is Nicole, I'm not sure. I'm curious, I mean, your presentation definitely elucidates how intertwined environmental justice is with other civil rights issues. And I'm wondering, for those of us who can sometimes feel paralysis of analysis, as we often like to say, how do you in your own life order your affections around this? And what's some of the reasons why you have decided to stand at this intersection, if you will?
Absolutely. So I know for me, I try to start with something like tangible that I can do that has like a deadline. So like for me, I'm a super voter. I vote in all my elections because it has a deadline and it's something very impactful that I can do, and I don't have to worry about thinking about it too hard, honestly. Like I can equip myself with, the knowledge of what's going on in my community, what I care about, who are the candidates, and I can go and vote and I can do something impactful in my community. That is for me, I just care deeply about having something that has a lot more structure to it. Because I think for me, someone's like, hey, learn every single environmental issue in the state of Georgia, I would be very stressed. So for me, if I can say, hey, I want my community to have lower energy bills. I want my community to have clean air. I want my community to be not further, but have less hazardous waste sites or something like that. There are candidates on the ballot that care about those sorts of things, and it's up to me to find out who they are. And so for me, I start with what do I want to see in my community, and who are those elected officials or those decision makers that are going to make effective changes in things. So for me, it's voting, but it's also just, what speaks to me specifically. Like I shared that housing justice video because I wanted to talk about, the intersection of housing justice and climate justice, but also spiritually, it spoke to me because that was at a time that the city of Atlanta was going through so much, and I just felt like everything was falling apart. I wish there was a clip in the video of Bertha Darden. She's a singer, incredible singer. And if you ever hear her sing, it will lift your spirit. And so for me, I think maybe it was divine timing, I'm not sure, but I just remember being in those protests and hearing her sing and felt like I was on the right path. Because my spirit was so weary, but as I was going to those protests, I felt, affirmed in what I was doing. So I think there are structurally things people can do, like voting or going to a county commission meeting and feeling like you're a part of the process, but it's also allowing your spirit to guide you to what you feel most impacted by. So for me, those are personally what guides me. I hope they answer the question.
I just have a comment really. I'm also a super voter, but I'm Bob. And so it's not easy for me. I read the national news, and look at NPR, and come voting time, I'm like procrastinating, I'm finding a job, trying to figure it out. And I mean, I was like very recently, I knew ESC was super important, but I'm sitting there trying, when you try and find the local stuff, it's not super easy to jump out. And so I'm Google reading and reading, trying to get it done. I'm racing up there at the very last minute with my little sheet, and yeah, nothing about it is easy. I mean, does your organization weigh in on this stuff, or they can?
We are a nonpartisan organization, so we, interestingly, we were gonna have a candidate forum with public service commissioners, but that didn't happen because elections are happening. But we do work with organizations to make sure that if there is a candidate forum, we ask questions about the environment. Also, shameless plug, hold on one second. Let me not go over the tea. We have a equal voter reflection guide. This voter reflection guide has a multitude of issues in it. It has specific questions that you can ask. So this is basically like our nonpartisan way of like, what are critical questions you could ask of yourself, of elected officials that engage in some of the issue areas that you care about. So I'm not sure if this will tackle it out, but I want to show it. But essentially, this is basically what we do in terms of like engaging in a way that's nonpartisan, more so about like, you care about justice. What does it mean to actually do that? And so we can't do the endorsing and things like that. But we do try to help, keep people generally informed of like what's going on and how they can, what their values essentially.
And that's because you're a nonprofit, like there's tax.
Right, we're a 501c3, right. We're an official 501c3, so we don't do any type of like political, like endorsements.
Okay.
So we only have just a couple of minutes left, so if you have a question,
Or comment, I don't know. Meditation and reflection.
Well, thank you so much, Jim, for being with us today. I really appreciate your guidance to think with the spirit that may in fact be guiding us, which harkens back to Carol's good comment to fall in love and let love guide us last week. So please join me in doing 11 things.
And I'm not sure if folks would be interested in a reflection guide, but if you are, there are some at the front, or I can bring them to you. So thank you all for being here and for listening to me, and also thank you for taking action. Not only for me, but for other children of the future, are going to be very grateful for the actions that we take today. So thank you all.